Welcome to the Paul Spradley Show, a show dedicated to real strategies from real people practicing real leadership in diverse and inclusive cultures. And now here's your host, CEO of the diversity training firm, the Care-Based Leadership Collaborative, Dr. Paul David Spradley.
Welcome to the show. I'm Paul Spradley, and this is the Paul Spradley Show, and I'm super excited about my guest today. My guest is Dr. Soren Fanning. Dr. Fanning is a former high school teacher. Currently, he's the Associate Professor of World History at the Robert Morris University, specializing in national and regional identities. Dr. Fanning, welcome to the show. And you've got an amazing voice, man, so you should read kids' books. Maybe that's something that you can
Well, there you go. That's a nice backup career. And I could bring it down here.
You could.
Give me, nice and stentorian.
Stand at the microphone like that. I love your voice, man. Thank you for being on the show. I'm excited. So
I'm happy to be here.
You've got an incredible perspective, I think, in the space of history. We're going to dive into that, but tell us about what you do and how you got there, right? Like, how did you go from teaching high school to not?
Well, it was a long and strange trip, is the best way to describe it. I kind of went into the family business through the back door. My father was a history professor of early medieval history in the foundation of the Christian Church, and it was a weird childhood. And I thought, man, I'm never going to be that smart.
Right.
But I did fall in love with teaching. So I got my teaching license. I'm teaching high school, and I'm enjoying it. But this is in the bad old days at the height of all the standardized testing, when we really started losing our minds in the 1990s. And it's the only way I can really describe it is we all lost our minds. And I remembered vividly, I'd always toyed about the idea about higher education, but it was always sort of off in the distance.
Right.
And I remember vividly, it was 2005, and we were at an in-service to help these kids pass these standardized tests. And one of the standards we had to teach was how you link the effects of the First World War, causes of the Second. Important. The guy says, now, notice nowhere in here does it talk about how World War I started. And I look through, and by Jove, you're right. And I'm thinking, well, they got to fix this. And he says, next sentence out of his mouth, so don't bother teaching it. At which point I did my little Hermione Granger. Yeah, excuse me. A banana in my ear. Could you repeat that?
Right.
Well, yeah, don't bother teaching. They're not going to be tested on it. So I went home, called my wife over and said, sweetheart, darling, remember that PhD I always kicked around getting? How would you feel? She was incredibly supportive. She said, no, I think you'd be good at it. So with a toddler at home and a mortgage in 2006, I went back for my PhD.
And maybe dive into your why, right? Like you said that you
I
were told
wanted
not
to teach. I wanted to teach. And the problem was I didn't leave high school because of the students. I loved the students. The students are fantastic. It was the current regime of standardized testing. You're not teaching, you're connecting dots of trivia. Mainly because the people who design and say what has to be on the history test usually have no background in education, usually have no background in history because they're elected officials. Now, I'm not slamming elected officials. They're good at certain things, but they're not educators generally, and they're typically not historians.
Right.
And it just got to the point where I decided I can't go along with this any further. I need to be in an environment where I can actually teach the subject the way it's supposed to be taught.
Which is what? Because I think one of the things that, and I'm often vocal about public school systems and how we're operating from what feels like a broken system that is from the past, and we haven't moved up or caught up to a space where we're teaching this next generation how to think, how to process, how to problem solve, understanding history as a framework, right? Like, so what is the right way to teach?
Okay, in my view, and I always preface, I could be wrong. I think if you're going to be a good educator, if you're going to study things, you always have to hold out that possibility. But the information and the studies I've seen seem to back this up. You can't get caught in the minutia. You have to teach people essentially how to handle resources, to be basically project managers in a way, to give them some autonomy. The reason we don't do it is not because we're dumb or because we're trapped in a system that people like. It's just this is the way it's always been done. And among historians, we call this path dependence.
Path dependence.
Path dependence.
Okay.
And this is the best analogy I can think of. If you look at your keyboard, whether it's a laptop or your phone, and you look and why are the keys laid out in that format? It's actually not to be efficient. It's designed to make things inefficient, to slow you down, because it's based off the typewriter. And if you type too quickly on the old mechanical typewriters, the keys would jam up and they could break. So they spaced the keys apart to keep that from happening. Made perfect sense at the time. We haven't had a problem with that in 70 years, but we keep using the old system because that's what we inherited. And I think that's the situation right now in modern public education. We have a system that's very much based off an industrial age model. It's governed by bells. We separate the subjects out when we should be finding areas of overlap. And how do we don't sort kids by ability. We sort them by date of manufacture. I mean, that's not my phrase, by the way. That was Sir Ken Robinson, who was a fantastic scholar on education, came up with that, but I've stolen it since then.
And he has some TED Talks as well, too.
Several,
Yeah, he's really good. So education now is not, so you're saying that, separating, finding the overlay.
We need to stop segregating intellectually. I think what we need to do is because for example, history bleeds over into psychology, which bleeds over into economics, which bleeds over into literature, which bleeds over into mathematics and sciences. All the subjects have areas of commonality. When you separate them out, you remove the ability to get not just inspiration, but context from these others. And more importantly, I think what we need to do is we need to group kids by ability level and not by age. There's, some people are better at certain topics than others. Math. That's usually the one that comes up. But people are, very good in the way they think in certain fields, not so much in others. We shouldn't stigmatize, for example, a 7th grader who needs, in terms of development, should be with 6th graders in literature, but should be with the 8th or 9th graders in math. That shouldn't be a stigma. But I mean, that's a whole podcast in and of itself. But what I try to do is I try to teach my students how things work together, how economics and geography and the environment, and most importantly, sense of self, identity, plays into how people make decisions.
Let's talk about identity.
Sure.
And how it makes decisions, right? So when we're doing diversity trainings, oftentimes at the end, we'll take them back through what we've done. Say, hey, we've talked about the organization, we've talked about you, and we've talked about sort of how you and the organization are positioned in this greater context. And a lot of times people have the toughest time thinking about themselves. So help me understand, and you're doing a lot of really cool work recently around identity, specifically as it relates to empire, so building.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that and really focus on that identity piece.
Well, what's interesting, identity is the core of what people are, which is why people don't like to examine it too closely. That can cause something of an existential crisis. I mean, if you think about it, if I were to ask you, what are you? There's a whole bunch of things you could mention. You're an American, you're a black man, you're a Christian, I'm presuming. Maybe you're a Steelers fan, maybe you're not, maybe, it's a different sport. There are all these different nested identities we carry around with us every day. It's like one of those Russian Matryoshka dolls, right? Every time you pull one off, there's another one inside.
Right.
The trick with empires, and empire itself is a weird concept. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan had an attorney general. We had one of our periodic wars on smut. And at a congressional hearing, he was asked, Mr. Attorney General, how do you define pornography? He said, I can't define it, but I sure as heck know it when I see it. Yep. In some ways, empire has become a stand-in for that. We substitute it as big country we don't like.
Wow.
And in reality, we need to come up with a sort of value-neutral definition. What the heck is this? And the way I've looked at it through my research is it's a state that governs multiple nations.
Okay.
Nations are these imagined communities. And I didn't come up with that phrase, but I'm going to borrow it. Sorry, Dr. Anderson. But these imagined communities, how we view ourselves, So, for example, the United States absolutely is an empire, but it is an empire, I mean, forget ethnic background for a moment, or even linguistic background. People from Boston have a very different sense of the world than someone from San Jose, California, versus New Orleans, Louisiana, versus Anchorage, Alaska. Those are just very different ways we look at the world. So part of what identity is, it's not reality, it's how we see reality.
Tell me more.
This idea of we make decisions not by what reality is, but how we perceive that reality to be, whether it's inviting or frightening or stressful, whatever that is. And there's a whole bunch of influences, from food to music to religious and social institutions, that help construct out that identity. Good example, you say industrial Midwest or Rust Belt. Automatically we come up with all these things that are part of that experience. From having job retraining to blue-collar parents to pierogies to whatever else it might be.
To scruffy beards.
Scruffy beards, right? Beer, not wine. Right. But all of these, though, feed into that.
Right.
A good historical example, actually, the Romans had struggled with this, because in some ways they were far more ethnically tolerant than we are. Actually, 2 Africans were emperors, Septimius Severus and his son Caracalla. But where they fell short was those white people on the other side of the Rhine. They could never wrap their heads around, because they didn't act, as the Romans would consider it, civilized. They crossed almost a vegetable barrier. They cooked with butter, not olive oil. They drank beer, not wine. It was so cold in the winter nothing could grow, and this was totally alien to the Roman experience, and therefore these Germanic barbarians were the other.
Okay.
But the people of North Africa, or Syria, or Egypt, well, they're like us, because they were from that same community. So as long as you dress like us and speak Latin and make offerings to the Roman gods, we'll treat you like one of us. So it's this idea of this constructed identity. So what empires have to do is balance these different identities out. And you can do it either the hard way, but ideally the most constructive way, which is construct spaces of tolerance and acceptance and give these different nations a voice. Or you do it the traditional way, which is simply you bring down the hammer on anyone who questions you.
Has that worked in the past, in either of those? And is there the possibility of that happening in the United States? I think people get so worn down by this empire and how segregated it is internally, even from Republicans and Democrats, from Christians and Muslims, right? Like there are these folks that are our neighbors, but we're not neighbors.
Right, and this is the central conundrum the United States has, because we explicitly set up our national identity to be one that was, if you read on paper, it is not ethnically based. It's based on values. So in theory, anyone can subscribe. Now, that's the theory. The reality, as we know, is that it's very much bound up in ethnicity and who was here first, forget Native Americans. It's all based up in those different constructs. So we have a disconnect. Now, in terms of what works, the Roman Empire survived for 500 years. You could argue it succeeded.
Right.
But then, of course, half of it collapsed in 500, and the other half collapsed in 1500. So, what works or what doesn't? Repression works in the short term. It never works in the long term. In fact, I would argue that the moment the Romans shifted away from being more tolerant and more accepting to very much, forget these Goths, they're not truly us. The moment there was no longer a benefit into becoming Roman, into embracing Romanness, that's when you shift to repression, and very shortly afterwards the empire collapses.
There's a term, nationalism, that is in the United States. We're seeing it pop up in different parts of the world.
Right.
Is there a space for these different nations under this empire to embrace nationalism where it's not as, kind of what you're saying, like as long as where it's not exclusive?
Right. You absolutely can't have inclusive nations. Theoretically, Christianity is one nation. It's a religious nation. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no space there for non-Christians. Think of a nation as a club you join. That's the best way I can describe it. And so you have bigger clubs that are more inclusive, that don't, to be an American doesn't mean you have to be Christian or just Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist or a non-believer. There's space there. Now the question is whether the people who are in positions of power are willing to allow that space.
Wow.
And that's the question. And it really comes down to, there was a sociologist, I should say, she's still alive, obviously, named Jane Coaster. I may have gotten that wrong, and I apologize if I did. But she just finished a fantastic study, a sociological study, about race and racism. And actually, she makes the argument racism might be the wrong word to use. Not that that's any less odious, but that very few people are genuinely racist in the sense that they see this person of this ethnic background as somehow beneath me in the sort of Nazi Untermensch sense of the term. I'm sorry, I'm going to cough here. Yep. I apologize. But rather, it's differenceism.
Okay.
This idea of that people tend to be hardwired in one of two ways. Authoritarian in the sense of preferring conformity, sameness, just like me. And libertarian, not in the political sense of the term, but in the, hey, difference is cool, hey, I want to learn more about that. The best way to think about it is if you go to a restaurant and they say, hey, we have a special, and they bring you a dish you've never seen before, or think, oh, this could be cool, or I don't think I really want to try that. And I won't go into the study, but they were asked, all these people were sorted by those predilections, and then asked questions about child rearing, something completely unrelated. Half of them were asked by someone of an ethnic or nation background just like them, the other half from someone very different. And they noticed that the people who were thrust into a position with someone very different who were authoritarian became more authoritarian. Those that were libertarian, I'm sorry, my voice is dying out here, I apologize. Yep. But those that were libertarian and were someone similar actually saw a similar decrease in energy. Like, oh, it's the same old, same old. And then they flip-flopped. So I would argue that the issue facing the U.S., in a way, this is what Barack Obama did brilliantly well, is to address diversity from a sameness point of view, to address the authoritarians. When that famous speech he gave in 2004 at the Democratic Convention, when he said there isn't a blue America or a red America, but a United States of America, is framing the argument in a way accessible to the authoritarian wing of our psychology.
So
I'm not sure I actually answered your question.
There's just a lot to unpack there.
There is a lot.
There's a lot.
That's why we write books like this about it.
Well, so the idea of this show, because there are people that want to learn, that want to grow, that want to dive into this. That idea of identity and empire, what's the takeaway from that as you're doing research and thinking about the two of these for the common person at home that's saying, listen, I think that there's a better option than where we're at right now. Like everywhere I look, we're fighting.
Right.
And I have some of this, so when you call it differentism, and I might need to see the study to push, because I might push back
Absolutely.
and say, because there's still this power space, right? There's still the idea of privilege playing out, and I'm okay with this idea of me having this difference, and I'm going to use that for my advantage. But
I'll send you the link, and maybe we can put it into the podcast.
Okay, yeah, we can add that in the notes, the show notes.
Absolutely.
But what's the takeaway? How do you take this and mush it down to an idea that's digestible for a person that's listening?
Three key things. One, empires aren't bad or good. That's just the way you describe a country. So it's not a value statement. Mm-hmm. They tend to be more successful because the more nations under your aegis, the more perspectives and ideas you get. One of the reasons the U.S. won the Second World War I mean, you could say, well, yeah, it's because we invented the atom bomb. Well, you think about it, how did we invent the atom bomb? How many of those scientists were those disaffected with Nazi Germany and fascist Italy who emigrated to the United States, including some German Jewish scientist by the name of Albert Einstein? You might have heard of him.
I've heard of him.
You know, things like that. Diverse empires gain strength. So the question is, how do we handle this now? And this is the key. Here's the third thing. The next decade, I think, is going to be much better than most people want to hope. I actually think the 2020s are going to be a fantastic decade. We're seeing for everybody in general, but typically those people looking for more inclusion and less overt antagonism. To, for example, I won't even call it a dog whistle, the bullhorn to white racist nationalists. That's going away fast. I just think if you look demographically, if you look at the groups that are voting, I see a sea change coming, probably starting in 2020. And I think what's going to be happening is, now this can either be rocky or it can be smooth, I don't know which one it's going to be. If you can find people who can articulate the advantages of a diverse population using the language of sameness, you're going to have an easier time. Then, and I know this sounds, mushy and very, Dr. Feelgood, but the problem is the best way to confront what we would call racism or differencism, I'm not saying that there's no racism there, is honestly through dialogue. That's really the only way that's been consistently shown to have results.
So, the trainings that I've just done in the past few weeks, one of the things that I say is first you have to talk about it, then you have to think about it, then you have to act. And because there's a process, right? Like this idea of talking is the starting point. We have not been allowed to talk about race, religion, sexuality, money, all of these things for years. We've just been told that's taboo in our cultures. We've been told not to talk about it. So you're suggesting that having the conversation is a place to start, and I'm saying that adding on to that, we have to then think about that. So like, what role have I played in this sameness space of making others not feel the same, right?
But also understanding that when you come to that conversation, regardless of where you're coming at it from, you're coming at it with a bunch of preloaded preferences that you had no say in. So rather than feeling attacked, it's something to say, it's all right, you didn't design the keyboard, this was given to you. But now that you know, what we can do is we can start designing a better system.
Love it, man. Yeah. So we're speaking the same language, like literally, because and I need to have you back on the show. So I'm going to ask you now to come back because there's so much more to talk about. And I think that the way that we're entering the conversation, literally, when we set out to start our company, we said we have to talk about racism, but we can't do it at the beginning of the conversation because half the room will check out.
Right.
If we like I'm not, but if you could have the conversation around this idea that we're all a part of the problem and all a part of the solution for a different way of thinking about this. Like we have to imagine this space with the baggage that we're coming in with and say like, all right, so I've got this baggage. Doesn't mean I have to carry it with me. That means that I have it. I acknowledge that I have it. You have baggage, and what can we do to kind of have this? We're looking at our own identity,
right?
And then we're understanding our shared identity after. That's next, right?
And the problem is dealing with identity is always the most fraught because you're dealing with people's senses of themselves, and the brain guards that jealously to the point of will occasionally embrace irrationality to defend it. Wow. There's actually psychology, there's a blowback effect they've discovered. It has a fancier name, but I don't remember. In which if someone has a position that, let's say, climate change isn't real, which can be demonstrably proven wrong. I'll even go a step further, flat earther, right? One of my favorite things, I was in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian, and at the Air and Space, they have these little pins. It's round, we checked. But if you present evidence, people will actually retreat further into that erroneous position rather than have it erode their sense of identity. So it's always very challenging, but I think part of it is language that's used. People will fight tooth and nail against being labeled as racist because of all the connotations. So, and I'm not saying that we ignore racism. That's not going to help. But you start the conversation by talking about differencism. That's a fairly new concept. And something people, it doesn't have all these preloaded values sort of set into it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I talk about when I'm doing the trainings, we want to sustain the conversation as long as possible because we need, in order to get to that space in the 2020s that you're talking about, like we have to sustain the conversation. And if the conversation gets clipped right here, then I'm going to just default back to what I've been doing and what my parents have been doing and what their parents have been doing. So this idea of sustaining the conversation is something that's very interesting. This might be a tease for the next time that you're on the show, but so we've talked about identities, we've talked about empires. What's the connection, maybe in 60 seconds or less, to policies, and how can our past, and if that's too much to unpack right now, we might have to do that.
I'll do my best. The big challenge is if you're going to govern a multi-identity society, which is basically what an empire is, you have to make the conscious decision, how do we bring all these different groups into the decision making? How do you share power? And that's really what all this is about. There are many people who have embraced racist policies who still firmly, truly believe themselves that they are not racist. They would make the argument that I have nothing, it's not the color of your skin. And in their mind, they're right, but it's the fact that your music is different, or your culinary habits are different, or your worldview is different that they oppose you. Now, that's all bound up in it. Saying, I have no problem with black people, I don't like black culture, that's a distinction hardly without a difference. But that's where the conversation starts to break down. So it's this, how do you convince these people who truly, and I don't mean these people and those people, but this population that believe they're under siege, and in many ways they're right, because their way of viewing the world is becoming increasingly outmoded. So yeah, they are under siege. Yeah. How do you sort of, almost like a scared animal, and again, I'm not saying they're animals, but sort of, tease it, it's okay, no one's gonna hurt you here, that sort of thing.
Yeah. We could keep talking. We're going to have you back on this show.
Absolutely.
How can people find you on if they want to connect and learn more, hear your views more?
Sure. You can get me unfiltered, fair warning, on Facebook. Just Soren Fanning. I'm pretty sure I'm the only one there. Or you can contact me via email at fanning, Fanning, at rmu.edu.
Great. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate you being on the show. That's our time for the day. Thank you, the listener, for making this show as popular as it is. Please join us next time when we talk with a highly decorated woman with over 30 years of experience advocating and educating around gender and race. You won't want to miss it. Also, please subscribe to this podcast. It helps boost our presence on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, and other podcast hosting sites. I'm Dr. Paul David Spradley, and until next time, keep on caring.